So from Gita's introduction, you might think that I had some talent, but the fact of the matter is that, and this is not false modesty, this is simple self-awareness, that I have relatively few talents. They're useful talents. I'd say I'm a good noticer. And in an American academic institution where there's no such thing as a command and control operation, that might be news to stern people. I remember there was a wonderful moment on our campus. It wasn't so wonderful for me personally. It was an agonizing moment for me personally, but a wonderful moment in terms of a vignette of perspective. Our doctoral students felt strongly that they should be allowed to form a union. And some of us who were put on earth to be teachers felt strongly that the relationship between a faculty member and students was sacred space, and you couldn't interpose there a mediating device that assumed a lack of trust. And there was just this chasm of difference, and somehow, this will seem odd to a stern audience, the students thought that I was the enemy, and if they could only get to the trustees would show enlightenment and would recognize them and as having this need for a union. And a group of about 20 of them were chanting outside of a trustee meeting, and a Stern graduate, I won't use his name, but he's prominently associated with an NYU school other than Stern. A Stern graduate put up his hand and he said, "Now let me get this straight. The dispute here is that you say that they're students and they say that they're workers." And I said to him, "You've got it." And he said, "So admit that they're workers and fire them." Now, I don't want to associate myself with those remarks, but I offer them as a lesson, a kind of case study, since some business schools are noted for case studies. It's a case study in the importance of the difference in perspective and understanding when you're moving from one perspective to the other. But I'm a good noticer. And if you're blessed with the kind of colleagues that you'll see today, and you notice what they're doing, then if you have a second skill, which is a skill I also have, which is if you're a good storyteller. So if you can tell now, as some of you know, I have, although people at NYU think of me as an academic lawyer, my first final degree, my PhD, is in the study of religion. And religions are the great stories of communities that come down, in the case of this nation, over millennia. These are our binding mythologies. Not myth the way Americans use myth as falsehood, but mythos as conveying the ineffable truth, the truth that can't be put into cognitive territory and terms. That no place understands this better than this place. So, you know, if you're trained in that, if that's been your study, then you're a good storyteller. And I can do that. So you start being blessed with great colleagues and talent, and then you notice what they're doing, and you tell the story of it. And sometimes it's a story, they recognize it, but they don't see it as themselves just yet. They would define it as progress, as opposed to the present. But it's really the present, but it's the story of what they're doing in the present. And then the other talent I have is, a friend of mine was very, very close to Ted Kennedy. And he was very late night up in Kennedy's secret Senate office, sharing a drink with the senator, when the senator commented on another prominent presidential candidate. I say presidential candidate in the wide sense, a presidential aspirant. I'm not going to use the person's name. You'll see why in a minute. And Kennedy said to my friend, you know, our father taught us to be presidents. And he taught us that the way to be a president was to surround yourself with people smarter than yourself. His father taught him to be president, and taught him the way to be president was to be the smartest person in the room. Well, you know, stern people know this. The Kennedy way is the way to success. So you surround yourself with people like Gita and Peter Henry, and the faculty you're going to see here. I've gone through life specializing in that. Now, my kids would say to you, it's not hard for Dad to surround himself with people smarter than him. But I want to bless Gita. It was very kind of her to introduce me that way. Now, I want to say a few things to kind of key in to the conference. And they're a combination of some of the things I said, for example, at the reception night before last, and some personal connection to the events of today. So I mentioned the other day, so this was night before last, so before yesterday, which was an important day for me here. But night before last, I mentioned that it was 50 years ago, this coming September, that I walked into my first class as a college teacher. A college teacher of religion. I was at a small Catholic college in Brooklyn where they could understand this accent. And I walked into that first class carrying in my hand a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, because the class I was going to teach was on world religions, and I was going to start with Hinduism and then go to Buddhism and Confucianism and on to Taoism and so on. For a decade before I went to law school, I taught the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas and the Upanishads and the great writings of Buddhism and Jainism and so on. All in translation. I wasn't good enough to do it in the original, to have studied it in the original, although some of my friends, when I went out to Elephanta the other day, I went out with one of the dearest couple friends of my wife and me, and the sister of the man that was on the boat going out to Elephanta is probably the world's leading scholar on Elephanta, and is a great professor at the University of Chicago. So I've been around people, you know, again, you surround yourself with people smarter than you that could tell me things, but for 50 years I've wanted to come here. It's my first visit. I've spent so everything I knew was out of books. And to go through this country over the last 2 weeks with my children and to experience it, and then I kept insisting, and people kept pushing back about these caves I'd heard of. And I had to get to these caves, Ajanta and Alara. And for some reason, people resisted, and there was denial of their greatness. And they sent me to Elephanta as part of the, you know, and finally, I was here yesterday myself, and I got permission from the dean to miss the dinner last night, so that I could see. This shows you, because I had extended my trip because of this conference beyond what we were going to do as a family. We were to return 3 days ago because my daughter's fiance was writing the script for the Golden Globes Award. He's a television writer. And I let them go, and at 4 in the morning I got up and got on the 6:20 plane out. And I spent the day, and my gosh, to touch this culture that way. And I say this to the students. I went downstairs to the students. I said, Gita, this is like a Jewish wedding. We got separate rooms, you know. So I went down because the Stern students don't like to hug. You know, the students at NYU know they can get a hug. The Stern students, although recent generations, and I must compliment the students in that room, they're huggers now. I think it's your influence. But so I went down to see if any of them were an extremist and needed a hug, and I gave it, and I had to come up here, so I gave a last hug to a person who could pass it on. You know, and I want to give a special shout out, because we who are born, and even a person like Paul, who you'll hear next, would say, I think that what drives us, of course, is we at research universities are about pushing the pebble of knowledge farther down the road, you know. But then it's sharing with these electrically talented young people that process of creating. There's an opinionator going on right now in the New York Times around the high of creation that we who are in the research universities feel, you know, and to share that with students is the most extraordinary experience a human being can ask. So I say to you the following, to connect these personal moments with your conference, and I won't take but 3 or 4 minutes to do it. What strikes me, having now touched India, as opposed to experience the reified, cognitive India of the pages of the writers that describe it, is a tremendous connection to the deepest spirit of New York. I said this the other night. I always describe NYU as cacophony and complexity. This is why it feels odd, although in a Stern audience, people understand the importance of aligning mission. I would invite the Stern folks to go back on my website and read the very simple idea, I now realize 12 years later, in the speech I gave at my installation. I had little to offer. I had no mythos. I hadn't begun the job of noticing and storytelling. But I said there was only one thing I could contribute. The Jesuits called it ratio studiorum. If you're blessed with having a classroom or a school, you have to be able to explain what it is you're trying to do, what your goal is. Business people understand this, teleological thinking, alignment of mission, whatever you do when you're writing to say it. It's very simple, okay? But the Jesuits called it 500 years ago ratio studiorum for us who are in it. And that's been my quest for 12 years, is to notice and then articulate. And to some it feels like usurpation, but actually it's just description. And the moment of epiphany for me was realizing that the cacophony and complexity of NYU as an institution, which had grown inductively. I say about NYU, if humankind has thought of an activity, NYU has a degree granting program in it, unless it's veterinary medicine. Everything else, I used to have to say veterinary medicine and engineering, but now we have engineering. Everything else we probably have 2, and the question is, do they know of each other? This is cacophony and complexity. Call this New York City, call this Mumbai. This is cacophony and complexity. And the absence of a campus. But the epiphany was seeing that as a learning opportunity and saying, this is the 21st century. And the challenge of the 21st century is going to be, are we able to create out of this cacophony and complexity not some homogeneous community? My gosh, India would be the last place in the world where you'd start talking about homogeneity. But a community of communities. And there's a way in which the 2 of the great experiments in the world, perhaps the 2 greatest experiments in the world, in creating a community of communities are New York City, which has in its public schools a child born in every country in the world, and India, with its 2,000 languages. So this is the challenge of the 21st century. Can we create a global civil society that knits together the idea capitals of the world into a circulating system? And this is what our university is trying to do, and of course, it's what Stern is trying to do, and what Gita is trying to do in her work. And of course, the center of this is going to be how we develop our cities. Because the vast majority of us, and you feel the press of it. You feel the press of it here, but you feel the press of it also in New York. As we realize in the wake of Hurricane Sandy how obsolete our city is and how fragile it is. Believe me, as a person who has, in a very Hindu way, God bless the woman I married, she enabled us. But essentially, we give away what we have at the end of every year. And we have only one asset. This may scare you about your university president, but this is a 70-year-old man with no bank account, no savings account. Okay, because we give away to an extended family. We have one asset on a barrier reef on Long Island called Fire Island. This is not a wise investment. This would not be Stern approved. But believe me, you understand if that's the way you're positioned in life, if that's your vantage point, the fragility of New York City. Because even the house in which I grew up came close to being destroyed. The houses on each side of it were. And they were in Brooklyn, not on a barrier reef. So we realize that as we try to build global civil society, cities are going to be at the center of it. And that's why, my life has been about attracting talent and putting it together. Faculty talent, putting it together, faculty talent, putting it together with student talent. And I frequently say, a decade of my life is worth bringing one extraordinary mind who will be shared with all my colleagues and friends. And as I turn it back now to Gita, with gratitude for giving me a few minutes to speak, I have to say, fortunately, there have been many that have joined us. But if there were only one, and that one were Paul, or that one were Gita, or that one would be the faculty you will hear from today, that's worth this being's work. So thank you to all of you who own India, who shared it with me. Thank you to Stern for epitomizing and incarnating the spirit of the Global Network University and for grasping it so fully. And thank you to Gita for being the magnificent study in violet that she is. Thank you.